tables are using statistics to sort data so that we can create graphs like histograms, frequency polygons, and pie charts. I'm going to show you how to make a frequency table. So let's get started. The first thing we need to do is to take a look at our data. Notice that I put my data in chronological order. This is very useful. Our next step is to determine our sample size. I took a survey of students at my college to see how many miles they lived away from campus. So what then is my sample size? Well, since I took a survey of 10 students, my sample size is 10. The sample size is signified by n. So n equals 10. The next thing we need to do is establish a width. Looking at my data, I think a width of 5 will set us just right. So now we can find our lower limits. Our lower limits are usually set with the minimum number in our data set. But this is not always the case. We can also start with 0. But I'm going to go ahead and start with 1. So how do we get the rest of our lower limits? Well, remember that our width is 5. So all we have to do is take 5 spaces between each number and we'll get our lower limits. So our next one is 6, 11, 16, and 21. These are our lower limits. Now that we've established our lower limits, we can set our class members. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 classes. Our next step is to establish our upper limits. So how do we do that? Well, we want to make sure that we don't have any overlaps. So our first upper limit should stop right before our lower limit in class 2 begins. So our first upper limit will be 5.9. Why 5.9 and not just 5? Well, if you notice in our data, we have decimals there. So if we have decimals in our data, we must put them in our upper limits. It's not necessary for the lower limits, but it is required for the upper limits. So how do we find the rest of our upper limits? You guessed it. We take our width and make sure we have 5 spaces in between each number. So our next upper limit is 10.9, 15.9, and so on. Our next step is to determine our midpoints. Finding our midpoints is real easy. All we have to do is take our lower limit, add it to our upper limit, and just divide by 2. So let's do that. Our first midpoint is 3.95. And how do we determine the rest of our midpoints? You remember the width of 5. So our next midpoint is 8.95, 13.95, and so on. The next thing that we need to do is determine our boundaries. So how do we do that? Well, finding our boundaries is a little bit more tricky. Let me show you. What we have to do is take our lower limit in class 2, add it to our upper limit in class 1, and then divide by 2. So our first boundary is 5.95. Notice that I placed our boundary in class 2. So how do I find the boundary for class 1? Well, just subtract the width of 5. So our boundary for class 1 is 0.95. And to establish the rest of our boundaries, we just add our width of 5. So our next boundary is 10.95, 15.95, and so on. But we're not done yet. With our boundaries, there's one extra step. We must list an extra boundary here. So I'm going to add 25.95. Don't forget to list this extra boundary before moving on. The next thing I'm going to show you is how to get our regular frequency. All we have to do is go back to our data and see how many times a number falls within our class limits. So let's take a look. We have 1 mile, a mile again, 2.5 miles, and 3 miles. These all fall in class 1, between 1 and 5.9. So class 1 has a frequency of 4. Then we have 6.5 miles, 8 miles, and 10 miles. They all fall in class 2, between 6 and 10.9. So we have a frequency of 3 in class 2. Doesn't look like we have any data for class 3. Class 4 has a frequency of 2. And class 5 has a frequency of 1. It's just that simple. We're almost there. Our final step is to find our relative frequency. This is real simple. All we have to do is take our regular frequency and set it over our sample size. Relative frequency can be listed as a decimal or a fraction. I'm going to use fractions. So our first relative frequency is 4 out of 10. And we just follow the list down. 3 out of 10, 0 out of 10, 2 out of 10, and 1 out of 10. And this is how you set a frequency table.